The weight of silence, Amani. Kareli had always known that silence could feel heavier than noise. In her neighborhood, silence was rare. Cars rumbled along cracked roads, children laughed in the small playground between the apartment buildings, and her mother's voice, tired yet warm, often carried from their kitchen window down to the street below as she called Khalil in for dinner. But inside Amani's head, silence had become a kind of companion. It was in the pauses between conversations at school, when people looked at her and then quickly looked away, in the empty seat beside her at the lunch table that no one ever chose, and in the hallways where whispers trailed behind her but never included her. It wasn't that she was invisible. Quite the opposite. Everyone saw her. They just didn't know what to do with her presence, so they left her in that quiet space between acknowledgement and exclusion. And though she carried herself with a kind of calm strength, that silence weighed on her shoulders every day she walked into Jefferson Middle School. At home, the world was different. The apartment may have been small, but it breathed with life. The living room was crowded with books her mother had collected from thrift shops and donation boxes, the walls decorated with family photos, and the kitchen always smelled faintly of cumin, garlic, or the sharp tang of vinegar from her mother's cooking experiments. Her mother worked 2 jobs, one as a receptionist at a dental office during the day, and another as a cashier at a grocery store on weekends. But she still managed to give Khalil and Amani the impression that they were her entire universe. Dinner wasn't fancy, but it was always intentional. A hot meal on the table, stories shared between bites, laughter that somehow stitched the frayed edges of their lives into something strong. Amani's mother often reminded her, "Baby, you are not just living for now, you are building for later. Everything you do is a step forward, even the hard steps." And Amani believed that. Her whiteboard was filled with those reminders, UCLA written in bold letters, arrows pointing toward law school, little motivational phrases she scribbled when nights got long and school days felt endless. That whiteboard was her anchor, a reminder that the silence at school wasn't permanent, just a step she had to cross. But school had its own weight. Jefferson Middle wasn't a place where she could simply blend in, though she often wished she could. Out of nearly 600 students, only 7 were black, and that number alone carried a quiet pressure she could never quite escape. Teachers seemed polite enough, but their eyes often slid past her when she raised her hand, choosing instead the familiar faces of students who came from families with old houses on tree-lined streets. When she did get called on, the room sometimes shifted, as if everyone was waiting to see how she'd phrase things, whether she'd sound different. Names like Anastasia, Giovanni, or Michelangelo rolled easily off people's tongues, yet her name, Amani, was slowed down, stretched out, turned into a puzzle they pretended was difficult to pronounce. Every syllable made heavy, exaggerated, as if she were foreign, even though she'd been born just 3 blocks from the school itself. She wasn't outwardly mocked most of the time. It was subtler, quieter, like little pinpricks against her skin that nobody else seemed to notice but that she carried home every single day. 7th grade had been the first time she realized how deeply those pinpricks could sink. There had been a history project where students worked in groups to present on different parts of American history. She was the only black student in her group, and when she suggested they talk about Reconstruction and the systemic barriers that followed the abolition of slavery, her groupmates shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a boy named Derek, laughed under his breath and said, "Why do you always want to make it about race?" The others quickly agreed to change the topic to the Industrial Revolution. Amani had gone home that day with her chest burning, not because she was ashamed, but because she felt as though her voice was being slowly erased. By 8th grade, she had grown sharper, not louder but firmer, unwilling to let those erasures pass unnoticed. She didn't pick fights, but she also didn't let things slide anymore. If a teacher skipped over the darker parts of a lesson, she asked why. If someone made a joke at the expense of others, she pointed it out. That sharpness, however, made her a target. People didn't like being reminded of their blind spots, and when you're 13, standing out for any reason often means standing alone. Tyler Cray was the first to openly challenge her. He wasn't clever, but he was bold. The kind of boy who thrived on attention, who measured his worth by the number of laughs he could pull from a room. When the class was watching a documentary on civil rights, he whispered loudly, "Bet Amani's going to stand up and give us her big speech now." and chuckled when a few others smirked. Amani could have ignored him. Part of her wanted to, but she felt that old burning in her chest, the one that came from silence pressing down too hard. She raised her hand, asked the teacher why they skipped over the scenes of people being beaten and jailed for murder, arching peacefully, and when Tyler muttered, "Relax," she looked him squarely in the eye and said, "I'm relaxed, you're just uncomfortable." The class had laughed, not at her but at him, and in that moment Tyler's smirk had faltered. For a boy like Tyler, being laughed at was a wound he wouldn't let heal quietly. That was the beginning. After that, the atmosphere shifted. It started small, shoulder bumps in the hallway, muttered words under his breath as she walked past. Then Jackson Hayes joined in. Jackson was different from Tyler, less brash, more deliberate. He had a cruel sense of humor, the kind that stung more because it sounded like a joke. He began mimicking the way she spoke in class, exaggerating her diction as though she were some stiff librarian. His imitations drew chuckles from others, and Jackson thrived on those chuckles like fuel. Malik Stafford was the last piece of the puzzle. Unlike the others, Malik didn't say much. He was quieter, but his silence carried a threat of its own. He would stand too close, lean just enough to make her feel cornered, his eyes fixed on her in a way that felt like he was daring her to break the silence. Malik didn't need to laugh or mimic. His presence was enough to make her nerves buzz, though she never let him see that. Outwardly, she walked straight, steady, chin lifted. Inside, though, she knew what was happening. The silence around her was being filled, not with support, but with hostility. By late October, Amani had carved out little rituals to give herself moments of peace. One of them was escaping to the West End bathroom during lunch. It wasn't the closest bathroom, but it was the most secluded. Teachers didn't bother going that far, and students usually stayed near the cafeteria. That bathroom became her sanctuary, her 6 minutes of solitude where she could breathe without eyes on her, without whispers trailing after her. She would count the tiles on the floor as she walked, 27 from the cafeteria to the bathroom, because counting gave her a sense of control, a rhythm that steadied her when the rest of the world felt unpredictable. It was in those minutes that she gathered herself, reminded herself of who she was beyond the school walls, rehearsed the words she scribbled on her whiteboard at home: resilience, justice, dignity. But even sanctuaries don't stay hidden forever. On that day when she walked toward her secret refuge, she saw them: Tyler, Jackson, and Malik, all three leaning against the wall across from the bathroom waiting. Tyler cracking his knuckles, Jackson wearing that smug half-smile that always came before something ugly, and Malik just watching, steady, quiet. Her stomach tightened, not from fear, but from recognition. This was the moment. She didn't flinch, didn't pause. She walked straight past them, opened the bathroom door, and let it creak shut behind her. Inside, the silence felt different this time. It wasn't hers anymore. It was charged, expectant, like the air before a storm. She walked into the first stall, locked it gently, and steadied her breath. Her hands were not trembling. They were deliberate, calm, as she pulled out her phone and propped it against the toilet paper dispenser, the screen already glowing. 2 clicks of the side button, and it was recording. She hadn't planned this, but she had known deep down. She had always known that silence could turn into confrontation, and she was ready. Ready not with fists or fury, but with something stronger: her voice, her truth, her proof. And as the voices followed her in, laughter bouncing off the tiled walls, footsteps echoing closer, Amani stood in that small stall with the weight of silence on her shoulders and the certainty that this time she would not be erased. The confrontation, the sound of their laughter echoed in the bathroom like something rehearsed, cruel in its rhythm, bouncing off the tiles until it wrapped around her stall like a noose. Amani's heart pounded, but not with fear. It was the beat of anticipation, the familiar rhythm she felt whenever she was about to step into a debate, whenever she had to speak a truth that others wanted silenced. She stood still, one hand pressed lightly against the stall door, the other tucked into the pocket of her hoodie where her fingers brushed against her phone, steadying herself with the knowledge that every sound, every word, every sneer was being recorded. She knew this wasn't an accident. The three of them hadn't just decided to wander to this empty wing of the school. They had planned this moment, thought it through, maybe even smiled at the idea of cornering her where no one could see. But what they hadn't known, what they couldn't possibly have guessed, was that Amani never entered a storm without carrying something that could anchor her. "Yo!" Jackson's voice rang out first, dripping with that fake casualness he always used when he wanted to sound in control. "You good in there, Carla Laley? You ain't gonna cry or nothing, right? 'Cause that'd be real awkward." His friends laughed, that hollow laughter that kids use to cover up the sharp edge of cruelty. It was meant to intimidate, but to Amani it only sounded like proof of their smallness, of how much energy they wasted trying to chip away at someone else. She stayed silent, her breath measured, her eyes fixed on the faint line of light at the bottom of the stall door. Silence had power too, and right now she wielded it like a blade. Tyler kicked the stall lightly, a dull thud that rattled through the metal. "Remember history class?" His voice was louder, sharper, carrying the sting of resentment, when she had to make me look dumb in front of everybody, like, chill, I was just joking. But nah, she wanted to act like some activist or something. More laughter, less confident this time, as if he was trying to convince himself of the humor. Amani closed her eyes for a moment, remembering that day in history class, remembering the way his smirk had faltered when she'd turned his insult into a mirror. She knew this was about more than one comment, it was about control. Tyler couldn't stand that she had taken it from him even for a moment, and here they were trying to reclaim it in the most predictable way. Then Malik's voice cut through, quieter but heavier. "She thinks she better than us," he said flatly. "Like for real, always walking around like she's too good." His tone wasn't mocking, it was resentful, and in some ways it was the one that sank deepest. Tyler and Jackson sought laughter, but Malik sought confirmation of a story he had already written in his head. Amani's hands tightened into fists inside her hoodie pocket, but her breathing remained steady. She understood something in that moment, Malik's silence, the way he stared. It wasn't emptiness. It was a story he had built about her, and stories like that could be dangerous, but she also knew stories could be rewritten. The three of them circled outside the stall, the sound of sneakers squeaking faintly against the floor, laughter punctuating their words. Amani let it wash over her, let it build, because she knew the longer they spoke, the deeper they sank into their own trap. When she finally chose to break her silence, her voice was calm, almost too calm, and it cut through their noise like glass. "Are you done?" she asked, her words echoing slightly in the tiled room. For a moment the bathroom went still. The laughter halted. Tyler snorted. "Oh, she talking now, took you long enough." Amani unlocked the stall slowly, deliberately, letting the creak of the door echo. She stepped out chin high, eyes steady, her posture carrying the same quiet defiance she'd shown in classrooms but magnified by the closeness of the tiled walls. She looked at them one by one, not rushing, letting her gaze linger, until the silence between each glance stretched so long it became uncomfortable for them. Tyler shifted his weight, his bravado cracking just slightly under the weight of her eyes. Jackson smirked, but it looked forced. Malik's stare remained steady, though Amani noticed the faint twitch of his jaw. "You think I don't see you?" she said finally, her voice low but clear, each word deliberate. "You think I don't notice the jokes, the whispers, the way you look at me like I don't belong here? You want me to be small so you can feel big. But here's the thing. You don't get to decide that for me." Her voice didn't waver, and in that moment she wasn't just speaking to them. She was speaking to every empty seat at the lunch table, every teacher who overlooked her raised hand, every smirk and whisper that had weighed on her since she walked through the doors of this school. The words poured out of her not like an outburst, but like something rehearsed, something inevitable. Tyler laughed again, but it cracked halfway through. "Man, you sound like a speechwriter or something. Nobody's buying that." But his voice lacked the force it had carried earlier. Jackson leaned against the sink, trying to look relaxed, but his eyes darted between her and Tyler as if he was searching for cues. Malik just stared, his expression unreadable, though his silence now felt less like dominance and more like hesitation. Amani took another step forward, closing the distance not with aggression but with calm certainty. "I don't need you to buy anything. I don't need your approval, your jokes, or your fake laughs. You wanted me alone because you thought that made me weak. But let me tell you something, you're not the first people to try and corner me, and you won't be the last." And I promise you this, every time someone tries, I will stand taller. Every single time. Her phone continued recording, unseen but steady, capturing every word, every shift in their voices. Tyler opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. He glanced at Jackson, who shrugged uncomfortably, the humor drained from his smirk. Malik's eyes lingered on her, something conflicted flickering in them, something tired. Hat suggested her words had landed in a place he wasn't prepared for. The silence that followed was heavy, but this time it was hers. She owned it, filled it with her presence until the bathroom itself seemed to echo with her strength. "You done?" she asked again, her tone the same calm steel as before. No one answered. Tyler muttered under his breath, something that sounded more like retreat than defiance, and Jackson pushed off the sink, heading toward the door with a shrug. Malik stayed a moment longer, his eyes meeting hers in a way that was neither threatening nor mocking this time, but searching. Then he too turned and left. The door swung shut behind them, leaving Amani standing in the middle of the bathroom, the silence now soft, no longer heavy. She walked back to the stall, picked up her phone and stopped the recording. She didn't smile, didn't collapse into relief, didn't celebrate. She simply tucked the phone into her pocket, her steps measured as she left the bathroom. Because she knew this wasn't the end. The confrontation wasn't about one bathroom, one moment. It was about something larger, the weight of silence that had followed her and the power she had just proven she could wield against it. The fallout. When Amani walked back into the cafeteria that day, the noise of clattering trays and half-shouted conversations felt sharper than usual, as though the walls themselves had absorbed some invisible current from what had just happened in that bathroom. She moved steadily, her tray balanced in her hands, but her mind was buzzing with the knowledge of what sat inside her pocket, a recording that was not just proof, but a shield. She had walked into the bathroom expecting only silence and 6 minutes of peace, and she had walked out with something else entirely, evidence of the ways silence had been broken against her. But she said nothing. She slid into her usual seat at the far end of the cafeteria, unpacked her sandwich, and let the room carry on as though she were invisible again. What she didn't realize yet was that invisibility had ended the moment she spoke up in that tiled room. The ripple had already begun. The first sign came the very next morning. As she walked down the hall toward her first period class, she felt eyes lingering longer than usual. Some kids whispered behind cupped hands, glancing at her as though she had grown 2 heads overnight. She caught fragments of sentences. "Did you hear what she said?" She straight up called them out. "Nah, Tyler was shook, man." The recording hadn't left her phone yet, but word of mouth was faster than any digital share. Someone must have been close enough to hear through the thin bathroom door, or maybe Tyler and Jackson had carried their humiliation with them in the tightness of their voices when they rejoined their friends. Either way, the story was out, and Amani could feel it brushing against her skin like static every time someone looked at her. By lunchtime, the whispers had become a current strong enough to shift the cafeteria's energy. People who had never spoken to her before stole glances in her direction. Yams, a girl from her math class, usually wrapped up in her own group, paused on her way to dump her tray and said quietly, "That was brave." Amani blinked, not sure how to respond, and by the time she had opened her mouth, the girl was gone. Later, one of the boys from science class sat at the edge of her table for a few minutes silent before mumbling, "Respect," and leaving just as quickly. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was something else, something that felt like cracks forming in the wall of silence that had always surrounded her. For the bullies, though, the fallout was immediate and visible. Tyler swaggered less in the hallways, his jokes thinner, his audience less willing to laugh. Jackson's mimicry, once sharp and constant, faded into forced silence when teachers glanced his way. And Malik carried himself differently, quieter even than before, his eyes avoiding hers not out of contempt, but out of something harder to place, something that looked almost like conflict. Amani noticed it all, but she said nothing. The recording stayed in her phone, untouched, though she thought about it every night as she sat at her desk under the glow of her small lamp, scribbling notes about what had happened, about what it meant to be seen, to stand tall in a place designed to make you shrink. By the end of the week, the story reached the teachers. It wasn't Amani who told them, it never was, but schools have a way of absorbing rumors until they slip into the ears of authority. Mr. Patel, her history teacher, called her aside after class, his brow furrowed. "I've been hearing things," he said, his voice careful, as though he were walking across thin ice, "about some kind of incident." Amani looked at him steadily, her hands folded around her books. "Which incident?" she asked, her tone neutral. He hesitated, then sighed. "With Tyler, and a few others. If something happened, Amani, I need you to feel safe telling me." She nodded once, but she didn't give him what he wanted. "I feel safe," she said, and left the room before he could press further, because it wasn't about safety, it was about power, and she wasn't ready to hand over what she had built by speaking out. Not yet. The administration got involved soon after. The principal, a tall woman named Mrs. Crawford, called her into the office. The waiting area was filled with stiff chairs and motivational posters, but Amani sat calmly, her phone heavy in her pocket. Mrs. Crawford's tone was practiced, professional. "We take reports of bullying very seriously," she said. "If you've been targeted, we want to make sure we address it." Amani met her gaze evenly. "I'm aware," she said, "and I know what I experienced." She didn't play the recording, not yet. She wasn't sure if showing it would make things better or worse. What she knew was that the moment she pressed play, the story would no longer belong to her. It would belong to the school, to the administrators, to whoever wanted to spin it into policy or procedure. And Amani wasn't ready for that surrender. She left the office with the same steady walk she had entered with, her silence this time a form of control rather than oppression. Meanwhile, the three boys were unraveling in different ways. Tyler grew louder in his attempts to cover the cracks, but the bravado rang hollow, his friends less willing to follow his lead. Jackson avoided eye contact whenever Amani passed, his smirk replaced by something tighter, almost embarrassed. And Malik lingered at the edges of hallways, his gaze sometimes finding hers before flicking away, as though he were carrying words he didn't yet know how to release. Rumors swirled that Mrs. Crawford had spoken to all three of them, but no one knew what was said behind the closed doors of her office. What everyone did know was that their reign of small cruelties had lost its shine. At home, the weight of it pressed differently. Amani's mother noticed her quiet, the way she lingered longer at the dinner table, her eyes unfocused. One night, as Khalil tapped his pencil against the table working on homework, her mother asked gently, "Something happened at school, didn't it?" Amani hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah," she said softly, "but I handled it." Her mother's eyes searched hers, worried but proud. "You've always been strong, Amani. Just remember, strength isn't just about standing up in the moment. It's about what you do after. It's about making sure the storm doesn't take more of you than it has to." Amani nodded, her mother's words sinking into her like seeds that would grow later, long after this week had ended. By the second week, the recording no longer felt like a secret. It felt like a choice waiting to be made. She could keep it hidden, let the whispers fade, move on quietly. Or she could release it, let the truth be undeniable, force the school to confront what had been happening in its hallways for years. She wrestled with the decision, scribbling pros and cons across the pages of her notebook late into the night. On one side, exposure, accountability, the possibility of change. On the other, scrutiny, backlash, the risk of being seen not as a victim or a fighter but as a problem. She had seen it happen before. Kids who spoke up only to be labeled troublemakers, their voices twisted until they sounded like noise instead of truth. The weight of the decision pressed hard, heavier than silence had ever been. It was Malik who pushed the balance. One afternoon, as the final bell rang and students spilled into the hallway, he approached her. Not Tyler, not Jackson, just Malik, his posture stiff, his eyes uncertain. He didn't block her path, didn't lean too close. He just stood there, his voice low. "You got it on your phone, don't you?" he asked. Amani's heart skipped, but her face remained calm. "Got what?" she replied. Malik looked away, his jaw tight. "The recording. I know you do." His voice was more weary than angry. And in that moment she saw the cracks in him too, the ways he was trapped by the roles he had chosen, by the silence he had filled with resentment. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked. He hesitated, then said quietly, "Because if it gets out, things change. For all of us." Then he turned and walked away before she could answer. That night she sat at her desk staring at her phone. Malik was right. Things would change, but as she replayed the voices in her head, the mockery, the kicks against the stall, the way her own words had rung steady, she realized this. A change was not something to fear. It was something to claim. The fallout wasn't just about what had happened in a bathroom. It was about what came next, about whether silence would settle back into its old weight or whether it would finally shatter. Rising higher, the following weeks at Jefferson Middle School unfolded like a shifting landscape, every corner of the hallways carrying whispers that refused to die. What had started as rumor had cemented into narrative, and by now everyone knew, whether by half-heard words, exaggerated retellings, or quiet acknowledgement, that something had changed between Amani Carryle and the boys who had once thrived on silencing her. Yet while the whispers churned around her like restless wind, Amani carried herself with the same steady pace, the same lifted chin, the same deliberate stillness that had carried her through the bathroom confrontation. The difference now was that the silence around her no longer belonged to her tormentors. It was hers to use, hers to shape, hers to fill with something far greater than fear or isolation. It began subtly. A girl from her science class asked one afternoon if Amani could look over her notes before a test. When Amani nodded and offered a few suggestions, the girl's grateful smile felt like sunlight breaking through gray. Days later, two boys she had never spoken to sat near her at lunch, not directly at her table but close enough to signal that the invisible boundary was shifting. And when Mr. Patel asked for volunteers to lead the next discussion in history class, more than one pair of eyes turned toward her, waiting, expecting. These weren't grand gestures of solidarity, but they were cracks in a wall that had always been impenetrable. And through those cracks, light began to filter. Amani, however, knew better than to mistake attention for acceptance. She understood that the same crowd that clapped when someone stood tall could just as quickly step back when storms rolled in. If she was going to rise higher, it couldn't be because of fleeting curiosity. It had to be built on something stronger, something that couldn't be washed away with the next wave of gossip. So she began to think not just about herself, but about others. The kids who sat alone at lunch, the ones who rarely raised their hands in class even when they knew the answer, the ones whose silence was not armor, but suffocation. She began to imagine a space where that silence could be broken, reshaped into something powerful. It was her English teacher, Mr. Braddock, who unknowingly gave her the spark. During one lesson, he assigned the class to write persuasive essays on any issue that mattered to them. While others scribbled about school uniforms, vending machines, or homework policies, Amani's pen moved swiftly across the page, her thoughts spilling out like water from a long-blocked dam. Her essay wasn't about cafeteria food or weekend rules. It was about voice, who got to speak, who got heard, and who was silenced in the spaces between. She wrote about classrooms where teachers overlooked certain hands, about hallways where laughter at someone's expense counted as entertainment, about cafeterias where tables acted like invisible fences. When she read it aloud to herself that night, she felt her pulse quicken, not from nerves but from recognition. These were words that had lived in her chest for years, finally finding their way to paper. And when she handed it in, something inside her told her this was only the beginning. Mr. Braddock returned the essays the following week, and when he placed hers on her desk, she noticed a comment scrawled at the bottom. "This is more than an essay. And this is a call. Don't stop here." The words burned into her, not like fire that destroyed, but like fire that forged. For the first time, an adult in the school hadn't just acknowledged her sharpness, they had urged her to use it. That afternoon, instead of going straight home, she stopped by the library, her notebook open, and began sketching ideas, not just for herself, but for something larger, a club, a discussion group, a space where voices weren't just tolerated but amplified. She didn't know yet what shape it would take, but she knew the seed had been planted. The following week, she approached Mrs. Crawford, the principal, her phone heavy in her pocket, though she didn't reach for it. She spoke clearly, steadily. "I want to start a club," she said. "Something for students who feel unheard, a place to talk about things that matter and not just in class assignments." Mrs. Crawford raised her eyebrows, surprised but intrigued. "You mean like a debate club?" Amani shook her head. "Not debate. Voice. Some of us don't get heard even when we're right. Some of us get laughed at when we speak up. That shouldn't be normal. I want a space where silence isn't punishment." There was a long pause, but then Mrs. Crawford leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "Write me a proposal," she said. "If you can explain how it'll work, I'll consider it." That night, Amani filled page after page with ideas, weekly meetings, topics that mattered to students, guidelines for respect. She stayed up past midnight, refining, reworking, until the plan felt like something solid enough to stand on. While Amani was building, the boys who had once cornered her were unraveling further. Tyler tried to reclaim his old swagger, cracking jokes louder than ever, but his words landed with less laughter each time. It was as if the cafeteria itself had shifted its taste, no longer feeding off cruelty the way it once did. Jackson retreated into sarcasm, but even his closest friends rolled their eyes, tired of jokes that no longer carried weight. Malik, though, was the most changed. He lingered at the edges of conversations, his usual silence no longer menacing but uncertain, like he was standing at a crossroads he didn't know how to navigate. Amani noticed him watching her sometimes, not with mockery, but with something harder to define. Curiosity, maybe even guilt. She didn't confront him, not yet. She knew growth couldn't be forced, only witnessed. The proposal for the club was accepted within 2 weeks. It wasn't grand at first, just a flyer on the bulletin board, a name she had written in bold letters across the top, The Voices Collective. The first meeting had only 5 students, sitting in a circle of library chairs, their voices hesitant. But by the end of that hour, when one boy admitted he'd stopped raising his hand in math because he was tired of being laughed at for trying too hard, and another girl whispered that teachers often brushed past her answers, Amani felt something click. This wasn't just a meeting. This was a mirror, reflecting back all the invisible struggles that had lived quietly in corners for too long. And she was the one holding that mirror steady. Word spread. Each week more students showed up, 10, then 15, then 20. They weren't all from the same background, weren't all black, weren't all isolated. Some were kids who felt pressure to be perfect, others who felt dismissed because of accents or clothes, others who simply wanted to be long. But together, in that circle, they found something rare, honesty without ridicule. And Amani, though nervous at first, grew into her role as leader, guiding discussions, encouraging quieter voices, challenging the group to think about change. She wasn't preaching, she was facilitating, creating a space where silence became a choice instead of a sentence. It wasn't without resistance. Some students mocked the club, calling it the complaint circle. Others rolled their eyes when they saw the flyers. Even some teachers dismissed it as just kids talking. But Amani knew better. She had lived long enough in silence to know how dangerous it was, how it carved deep cuts no one else could see. And now, with every meeting, she was proving that silence could be transformed into power. One afternoon, as she packed up after a session, Malik lingered at the library door. He didn't step inside, didn't speak right away, but when the others left, he approached. His voice was quiet, rough. "I don't get it," he said. Amani looked up, steady. "Don't get what?" Malik's eyes flicked toward the empty chairs. "This. Why you even bother? Like, they still gonna laugh. People still gonna do what they do. You can't change that." Amani met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "Maybe not, but I can change what silence feels like. I can make it so people don't feel alone in it. That matters." Malik's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and left. For Amani, it was enough. Cracks had to start small before walls could crumble. At home, her mother noticed the shift too. "You're glowing," she said one evening as she set down bowls of soup. "I don't mean just happy, I mean glowing, like you're walking taller." Amani smiled faintly, shrugging. "I just feel like I'm doing something." Not just surviving school, but making it different. Her mother's eyes softened. That's how leaders are born, baby. Not from wanting attention, but from carrying responsibility. The words sank deep, wrapping around Amani like armor. For so long, she had felt the weight of silence pressing her down. Now, for the first time, she felt the weight of leadership lifting her up. The Voices Collective grew into more than meetings. They began drafting a letter to the school board about inclusive teaching, proposed a campaign against microaggressions, and even organized a lunchtime forum where students could share their stories openly. Teachers began to notice. Some supported them, while others remained skeptical. But there was no denying that something had shifted in the culture of Jefferson Middle. Where once silence had suffocated, now voices were rising. Not perfect, not always loud, but steady, undeniable. Through it all, the recording remained on her phone, untouched. It no longer felt like a weapon she needed to wield. It felt like a relic of the storm she had already weathered, proof of a past that had given birth to her present strength. Sometimes she replayed it late at night, hearing her own calm voice echoing through the bathroom, reminding herself of the moment she chose to stand. But she didn't need to share it anymore. Her presence, her leadership, her vision, that was proof enough. And as winter gave way to spring, Amani realized something she had never allowed herself to believe before. She wasn't just surviving middle school anymore. She was shaping it, rising higher, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt the weight of silence pressing down. The legacy. By spring, Jefferson Middle School was no longer the same place that Amani Cariel had entered at the beginning of the year. The air itself seemed different, still thick with the usual noise of adolescence, still buzzing with gossip and fleeting dramas. But beneath it all was something steadier, something that hadn't existed before, an undercurrent of awareness. Students who once smirked or shrugged when someone was mocked now shifted uneasily, some even stepping in. Teachers who had overlooked subtle cruelties began pausing, paying more attention to the dynamics in their classrooms. And while not everyone embraced change, no one could deny that the silence Amani had once carried like a weight had been broken. What was once invisible had been named. What was once endured quietly had been spoken aloud. And at the center of that shift stood Amani, not a celebrity, not a figurehead, but a girl who had refused to shrink when the walls closed in. The Voices Collective had grown beyond what she had imagined. What started as a handful of students meeting in the library had become a recognized organization, complete with posters on the walls, a small corner in the school newsletter, and the occasional visit from teachers who wanted to listen rather than lead. They hosted open forums where students shared experiences that had long been buried, stories of being dismissed for speaking with an accent, of being laughed at for clothes that didn't fit the latest trend, of being silenced for raising difficult truths in classrooms. Each story added another thread to the fabric they were weaving together, a fabric that covered not just their wounds, but their hopes. Amani sat at the center of it, not as someone who had all the answers, but as someone who held space for the questions that mattered. Her leadership was not about commanding, it was about listening, about reflecting strength back onto those who didn't yet see it in themselves. The administration could no longer ignore the shift. Mrs. Crawford, once cautious, now praised the group publicly, calling them a model of student initiative. Teachers who had dismissed them as complainers began asking if they could attend meetings, and though the students sometimes resisted, wanting their voices to remain free of adult interference, the respect was undeniable. Change was slow, uneven, and imperfect, but it was visible. The cafeteria, once divided sharply along invisible borders, saw new combinations of students sitting together. Hallway laughter lost some of its edge, replaced by glances that carried hesitation before cruelty. It wasn't utopia, but it was progress, and progress was enough for now. For the three boys, the fallout had left different marks. Tyler, who had once thrived on being the loudest in the room, found himself quieter, his jokes less frequent, his audience smaller. The sting of losing his control over the narrative cut deeper than any lecture could have, and though he never admitted it aloud, he carried the lesson in the slump of his shoulders. Jackson drifted away from the center of attention, his sarcasm losing its shine. He tried to reinvent himself with other friends, but the smirk that once defined him no longer carried power. Malik, however, was the one who changed most visibly. He attended a Voices Collective meeting in late spring, slipping into the back row, silent as always. He didn't speak that first day or the next, but his presence was enough to raise eyebrows. When he finally did speak weeks later, his voice was low, almost ashamed. "I was part of the problem," he said simply, the words heavy but honest. The room had gone quiet, every eye on him, but no one mocked him, no one dismissed him. Amani met his gaze, steady, and nodded once. Forgiveness wasn't instant, but accountability was the first step, and Malik, or the first time, had taken it. At home, her mother's pride was evident in every look, every word. "You've turned your storm into a lighthouse," she told Amani one evening as they washed dishes side by side. "Do you know how rare that is? Most people drown in their storms, but you, baby, you're showing others the way through." Amani smiled softly, her hands submerged in warm water, the metaphor sinking deep into her bones. She thought of the bathroom stall, the echo of laughter, the weight of silence pressing down. And then she thought of the circle of chairs in the library, voices rising one by one, the glow of possibility in faces that had once been bent with resignation. The contrast was stark, and it told her everything she needed to know about who she was becoming. The year ended with an assembly, the kind of event students usually dreaded. But this time the buzz was different, the anticipation sharper. Mrs. Crawford had invited the Voices Collective to speak. Amani had hesitated at first. She had never sought the spotlight, never wanted to be the girl standing at the front of the gymnasium with hundreds of eyes on her. But when the group asked her to represent them, she knew she couldn't refuse. It wasn't about her. It was about every student who had ever felt silenced. So she stood at the podium that morning, the microphone trembling faintly in its stand, and she spoke. Her voice was steady, clear, carrying across the gym without strain. She didn't tell the story of the bathroom, didn't name names, didn't point fingers. Instead, she spoke of silence. She spoke of how it suffocates, how it isolates, how it convinces you that you're alone when you're not. She spoke of the courage it takes to break that silence, of the responsibility they all carried to make sure no one else was left alone in it. She told them that change wasn't about grand gestures, but about small choices. Choosing to listen, choosing to speak, choosing to stand beside instead of apart. As she spoke, the gym grew quieter, the restless shuffle of feet fading into stillness. When she finished, there was no eruption of noise, no thunderous applause. Instead, there was a moment of silence, true silence, not heavy or suffocating, but reverent, full of recognition. Then the clapping began, slow at first, then building, until it filled the room like a wave. Amani stood there, her chin lifted, her heart steady. And for the first time she understood fully, this was her legacy, not what had been done to her, but what she had built in response. Summer came, and with it the promise of high school. The thought of starting over in a larger, more complex environment was daunting, but Amani no longer saw herself as someone who merely endured. She carried with her the certainty that she could shape spaces, that her voice mattered, that silence could be transformed. Her whiteboard at home now carried new words alongside UCLA and law school. Leader, builder, voice. She no longer needed to count tiles to feel in control. She carried her rhythm within herself. On the last day of school, as students spilled into the sunlit courtyard, Malik approached her once more. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "You change things," he said. She looked at him, steady, and replied, "We all can." He nodded, the weight of his silence finally lifting, and walked away with the faintest trace of relief on his face. Amani watched him go, not with bitterness, but with recognition. Even those who once tried to corner you could learn, could grow, if given the chance. As she walked home that afternoon, the air warm, her backpack heavy with the year's remnants, she thought of the bathroom stall, the recording still tucked away in her phone. She no longer needed it. She no longer needed proof. Her life itself was the proof of resilience, of strength, of the power of voice. She thought of her mother's words, of storms and lighthouses, and she knew that this was only the beginning. High school would bring new storms. The world beyond would bring greater ones still. But she carried within her the knowledge that silence was no longer her prison. It was her canvas, and with every word she spoke, she would continue to paint it with courage. Amani Karile was not the girl who had been cornered in a bathroom. She was the girl who had turned that moment into a movement, who had risen higher, who had left behind not just a story, but a legacy. And as she walked into her future, her steps steady, her head high, she carried with her the unshakable truth. Silence could be broken, storms could be weathered, and voices once freed could change the world.